Hi, and welcome to the NCSFA webinar series with Mark Canton of Mercury Associates. Mark is a senior manager with Mercury Associates with more than 20 years of experience in transportation and fleet management. He directs the company's data analytics team. He has worked extensively in university transportation, logistics, and fleet management. His experience includes technology and software implementation, the development of driver staff training modules and curricula, fleet management policy, vendor management, strategic planning, and process reengineering. At Mercury, he is involved in data analytics, best practices assessments, and other fleet management projects. Mark is a National Safety Council certified defensive driving instructor. With that, I will take it over, Mark.
Hi, everybody. Thanks all for having me so much. We've got a lot of slides to go through today, so please forgive me in advance if we go through quick. I'll keep an eye on the time. May have to even skip a couple, but we will make some time for some questions and answers at the end. So just jot down a note and we can always go back to something. Just real quick, a little bit about Mercury. It was established in 2002. We are the largest dedicated fleet management firm, at least in North America, if not the world. And we exist, our vision, our mission is purely to help organizations manage their fleets and improve their practices, their efficiency, and their efficacy. So today's agenda, we're going to start with organizing and prioritizing fleet data, talk briefly about some data sources and data aggregation. We'll talk about fleet performance as fundamentally that is normally the most common use for data in the fleet management industry, but we'll also talk about some other uses. And then we'll, time permitting, we'll talk a little bit about the data visualization and the importance of that. So like I said, I'm going to go fast in some slides and maybe slower on some others. This first one, I'm going to go a little bit slow on. I'm going to resist the urge to read to you. But right now, what I think a lot of fleet managers are experiencing at virtually every level, from small local fleets to large universities and large state fleets, and certainly in the private sector and federal government as well, is sort of the information overload. Everyone feels a need to use data. And understandably so. The world of management as a whole has gone to data-driven management and the big data phenomenon. And so there's a need to have information systems, have technology, whether that's telematics, whether or not that's sensors on your tires, rings at your fuel system, and obviously your fleet management information system. But the problem is, in our experience, is that folks invest quite a bit of money into these systems, but they don't develop a comprehensive plan to be able to realize a return on investment on that. Okay? Collecting data without a plan basically is a waste, time, effort, money, and then usually frustrates organizations. So I'm aware, I've even some NCSFA members who have done things like buy a GPS telematics system, have big ideas and big plans for what it will do for them. And then a few years later decide we're spending all this money and we're not doing anything with it. And so they're canceling it as soon as they can get out of their contract. So, again, ultimately it becomes frustrating and frankly, it goes unutilized. So a plan is not the same thing as a vision, an idea, a mission, a goal, or hope. And as part of that message, I want to say that no system, no matter how great and wonderful that system is going to magically solve all of your data and analytics needs and desires. You need to have a plan, and you need to recognize that the technology involved is only one step of what's necessary to have a really good fleet management data program. Okay. So again, usually you need to have policies and procedures on data collection. You have to have competent staff. Those staff needs to be trained, okay? And if you could have the most intelligent people in the world working for you, if they're not trained on how to use the information systems they're using or how to analyze data, that's not going to help you very much. Conversely, you could have the greatest data analysts on the planet, but if they're not trained on things fleet, they're only going to be able to help you so much as well. Okay. We won't address everything today, but we hope it helps get you started. And yeah, let's get into it a little bit. Okay, so the one thing that if you take nothing else out of today, again, you have to have a plan And obviously having a plan begins with setting objectives, okay? So you have to ask yourself, what information is going to help you to drive efficiency or to make decisions? What do you need for your particular set? And I mean that very literally. I mean, you know, there's a chat going around today, and over the last few weeks, there's been a lot of group questions. Hey, folks, what do you do for this? How many people are on staff? Are you centralized? Are you decentralized? The thing with the NCSFA, folks, is that you know, you're really very diverse in terms of the nature of the fleet management organizations you manage. And so the answer for one of you may not be the same as for the next one next to you. So what information do you need? Okay. The other question is, well, what information is important to leaders and customers? So really 3 stakeholders we're talking about: yourselves, the leaders, and your customers, okay? All right, what metrics are gonna help you tell that story and give insight with regards to the information these folks are looking for? What data points do you need to calculate the necessary metrics? So again, folks say, well, I want a KPI and I want to be able to say we're doing this well or not. Okay, well, how do you get there? So first off, what are the metrics? You know, what's the information you need? What are the metrics you need? What data do you need to collect in order to be able to calculate those metrics? Okay, now that you know the data, you've identified the data, what tools are necessary to collect that data? Well, is everything coming out of the information system? You need to tap into your budget and financial system. Is telematics going to do the trick for you, et cetera, okay? And then you have to define policies and develop standard operating procedures that that ensure the accurate data capture. And you need to essentially train for this, and as well as create a culture for this. So this is important. Use this example next here. All right, organizing data and how you're going to capture data before you collect it is everything. So this is an example of VMRS codes. Okay. If you're using codification, you need to be sure that the folks who are responsible for inputting this data or manipulating the system are all on board with this system. You know, in this example, as you can see, there's 631 VMRS codes being used by this particular fleet organization, and 80% of all M&R costs are captured in the first 7 lines. So purely by doing codification properly, there's so much insight that you can gain. Now, if for those of you who aren't touching in-house maintenance and repair, and so the VMRS codes are kind of foreign to you, you know, think of it in terms of simple entries. Have you ever had a system where, you know, one person puts in repair brakes, another person puts in repair front brakes, repair rear brakes? Well, when you're trying to capture all that and look at it as one system, since everybody's using a different terminology or maybe a different acronym, it appears as disparate pieces of information, but in reality, it's the same. So think these things through. How are we going to capture? What, you know, how do we codify information? So this is just one example of the importance of organizing the data and understanding what you're going to collect in advance. You have to have a plan. Don't have time to go through every single example and every possible thing of that nature, but it's absolutely important to have a sense of how the data is going to be organized even before you begin the process of developing a fleet data program. Okay, so here's some key questions to consider in order to help you figure that out. And forgive the typo, it says is all the date, and I should say is all the data. Is all the data you need in your FMIS? If not, where do you go for it? Is it your budget system, telematics, cost data, utilization data, driver data, supplier data? I can tell you that even the greatest FMIS systems in the world will probably not have all of the data that you might want to consider when doing data analysis for decision support or for you know, organizational insight, which we'll talk more about later. All right, how confident are you in the accuracy and the completeness of that data? Okay. What information is needed at each level of your organization to manage? What do you actually have available? In other words, are you collecting the data that's necessary to be able to produce meaningful outputs for the various people in your organization, for your customers, for your leaders, et cetera? And if not, how can you do that? Does your system allow for that and you're just not doing it? Does your system not allow for that, et cetera? Is anyone actually using the data? Right, so you have the reverse where people are collecting all kinds of data and have no idea how they intend to use it. Okay. All right, so next question is, how well do you develop and distribute information to help decision makers and other stakeholders, whether that's for fleet costs, performance, et cetera? So I can't tell you how many organizations I'll talk to, and I say, well, what reporting are you doing? And they'll say, well, we're asked to do this, and maybe they do an annual report or something like that. Well, the heck with what you're asked to do. And we can have a whole nother conversation on the importance of reporting. But I highly recommend that you all are regularly putting out various reports, briefs, longs, etc., on various items around associated around fleet, and a lot of them should really be centered on performance, performance indicators. If possible, I suggest you do this monthly, but at minimum quarterly. All right, and then obviously, how's information technology changing the way your organization manages fleet? Okay. Last question: What are your decision makers using to base their decisions on? Is it subjective? Is it objective? More and more today's leaders are, or at least attempting to make decisions based on objective information, which always means the inclusion of data analytics. So some things to remember, we'll get in, before we get into the nitty gritty. No data source is perfect, even telematics. And, we can talk about some of the issues there if time permits. Manual data entry should absolutely be minimized. So for those of you with in-house M&R programs, and you still are recording that on paper, and then that paper is getting transferred maybe to an administrative assistant of some sort, and then that person's entering it. Every time it touches a hand, every time it's manual, you increase the likelihood that it's incorrect, or that there's a fat key entry, et cetera, et cetera. If you can do that in an automated way at the workstation via a tablet or via the computer, and again, the timeliness, the quicker, if it does have to be manual, the quicker it gets in, the more likely it is to be accurate, the more likely people are to catch an issue with it and correct that issue. Okay. You got to have routines for data validation. I cannot tell you how many organizations don't look at their data until it is reporting time, or they do engage us for a study, and then they realize, oh, that can't be right. Well, this is not right. So that's got to be part of the normal routine, that you're going through the data and the inputs and the various entries into your information systems, and that you're checking those, that you're saying, yeah, this makes sense, this passes SNP. The good news is many newer systems have built-in exemption reporting for these sorts of things. So for example, someone makes a fat key entry on a mileage, it'll recognize that entry is not reasonable and alert you to it. But there's still a lot of growth to happen on that front, and it's really only in a few fields. So you certainly got to continue to have a routine for data validation. So again, in order to keep your data, to keep the integrity of your data, you've got to have ongoing maintenance routines. And then finally, data has context. I have here idle isn't always idle. Another one is, utilization, or lack of utilization is not always lack of utilization, right? You have the plumber's truck or the plumber's van, doesn't get any miles on it. Maybe they drive a mile or two across the facility, but there they are all day, and they're using that vehicle as a mobile workstation with supplies and tools. It's getting used all day to do repairs in that building, drive back another mile or two. If all you're looking at is mileage, you say, oh, this thing was barely utilized. Well, if you do that, then you fail to understand the context of the data. All right, some quick thoughts on data acquisition and aggregation. So here are some sources to consider outside of the FMIS, okay? So again, more and more, we're encouraging organizations to sort of think beyond the FMIS. Obviously, the FMIS is still the center point. It's still the heart or the lifeblood of fleet data, but it's certainly not the only source. And more we're suggesting that folks aggregate their data into usable portals or usable frontline analytic systems, so that you can make considerations about all portions of data. So for example, here are some examples, driver health records. Maybe that driver shouldn't have the vehicle because they haven't submitted their physical for the CDL. If your systems aren't talking to each other, you may never know that. And you could have someone out of compliance driving the vehicles all the time. Some of these are more common to you. I think getting inputs from commercial and bulk fuel systems and having that push through to your FMIS is certainly much more common. So a key thing to consider when you're considering these data sources really is, are they integrable? How well do these connect? Can they talk to each other? And be careful of the trap, because with all due respect to my colleagues in the various industries, part of marketing is to say, yeah, we can function with this, or we can integrate with, this telematics system can integrate with this FMI system, or this motor pool system can integrate with, and so forth and so on. And sure, they can, but a lot of times I've seen fleet managers, they buy the products and they say, okay, guys, you said you can work together, go ahead. And, and then they're left holding the bag when they realize, yeah, they said they can, they didn't say that they would do that work for you. So certainly when you're in the process of selecting vendors or doing bidding or however you're acquiring the various information systems you certainly want to include that in the bid, right? Who is going to do the work to make it talk with your existing system? Is it someone on the existing system side? Is it someone on the new system that you're buying? But that's certainly a key aspect to the plan. It needs to be ironed out in advance of any acquisition or attempted implementation. And this is just an API. You've all heard API, application program interface, an example of how to make systems talk to each other. So again, we believe it's absolutely key that the systems you acquire are integrable. Okay, quick high-level understanding of the data analyst process. All right, so you have to ask a question: what are the sources of data, like we talked about? Conduct exploratory data analyses, which we'll get into. Clean that data. Select appropriate analytical techniques and conduct the analysis, and then challenge your results. Okay, so we'll talk more about that. So the first thing I want to talk about, as far as a common use for fleet data, is fleet performance management. That's probably the most common thing all clients are interested in, and leadership tends to be interested in well. So performance measurement is certainly the most common. The two other most common really are it's decision support. So how to to try to dig up some insight to help the organization make a decision. Often that's strategic, but there are certainly examples of tactical, such as repair versus replace decisions. Some strategic examples are, life cycles, whether or not to insource or outsource, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then the other thing is the most common is really development of business intelligence. So we'll talk about the second two a little bit later on. Right now, I want to zone in on performance measurement a little bit. All right, so we've got some definitions up there for you. It's the use of quantifiable indicators to assess how well an organization or business is achieving its desired objectives. Okay. As part of that, the most common term that you'll see associated with performance measurement is a metric. Okay, the expression of some attribute of conditions, activities, or performance in quantitative or measurable terms. Okay, so one of the jokes I often make with clients is, hey, you hired me to translate operations to finance. Okay, see, and so finance, like a lot of other professionals, they speak in terms of numbers. What's quantifiable? Does that mean that the whole story will be quantifiable? Maybe not, but it's certainly my experience that there's a lot of opportunity to tell much more of the story in quantifiable terms than most organizations are doing today. Okay. So using metrics to manage performance. So step one is, again, identify the objectives. What is it that I want to measure? What is it that I want to do? Okay. In doing that, you can define the metrics. All right. Once those metrics are defined, then you can, calculate your performance statistics accordingly. But really, there's a little intermediary step there is, okay, what's the data I need? And this is where IT and analytics cross over. So in the IT side here, after you've defined the metrics, you determine what are the data sources you need, and you go out and make sure you're collecting that data, collecting it well. On the analytics side, okay, we have the metrics, we know what we need, let's calculate our performance statistics. All right, we'll compare statistics to benchmarks to verify the data is accurate. We'll evaluate the conditions and the practices, and then we'll try to re-engineer the processes. And once that's improved, we go back and measure it again and see, did the re-engineered processes have any positive impact on our performance? Okay. So the step 1 and 2, again, defining the objectives and the metrics. And here are just some examples, right? One objective of fleet for that vehicles are available. Well, the performance attribute would be uptime, right? The opposite of downtime. And then you can find the performance measure. So an example might be the average percentage of units available for use per day. A lot of folks know that as availability rate. Okay. Another objective would be that the assets are suitable, right? The performance attribute might be the extent of use. And that might be, one measure might be purely utilization. Is this thing getting utilized? Again, I won't read all of these to you, but Reliability. Another objective of fleet is to provide reliable assets. Well, are we doing that? Well, how many breakdowns do we have? Okay. How do we measure that? In miles or hours per breakdown? Is it safe? What are the crashes? The most common safety metric is for vehicle operation is crashes per million miles. Okay. And so forth and so on. So then to look a little bit more at specific, okay, let's use this example. Suppose you want to determine the appropriateness of fleet maintenance and repair costs, and obviously reduce if and where possible. So that's your goal. That's your objective. Okay. Well, what are the metrics you need? All right. You might want the average annual M&R cost per vehicle or per VEU. Some of you have heard this, we talk about this before, vehicle equivalent unit. And what is that? So it's your total M&R cost. So in-house M&R cost, in-house parts cost, sublet cost, and so forth and so on in terms of a standard sedan. So you could take all of the various vehicles in your fleet and normalize them to have a value or a rating in terms of a standard passenger vehicle for your fleet. So if the standard passenger vehicle is 1 VEU, something much larger might be 1.5 or 2 VEUs, etc. Okay, but some other metrics might be an average cost per mile or hour of use, depending on your use case. Certainly in transportation or logistics, this is a common metric. And then you might have an average cost per hour of in-house mechanic labor for hours charged to work order. So let's calculate some performance statistics. So now you have your average M&R cost per VEU per year. Again, 1 VEU represents the amount of effort. Okay, normally that's about 12 to 15 hours of direct maintenance for technical labor. Certainly if you have a younger fleet, that's going to be a little bit lower. Fleets who are maintaining or fairly strict replacement cycles and honoring those replacement plans, you might see something lower in the 8 to 10 hours of labor hour. Okay, this is what we talked about the fleet in terms of VEUs. Okay, so if you have the annual cost of all M&R activities, right, and you divide that by the number of VEUs in the fleet, okay, this is just an example, 3.34 million divided by 1,200 VEUs, and you get 2,780 VEUs per year. All right, so that's kind of expensive. All right, to give you an idea, in our experience, state and local fleets typically have somewhere around 2.2 VEUs per vehicle. Obviously, it depends on the state and the organization itself, but that's a fairly common. It'll range in there somewhere between the low 2s and the mid 2s is most common. For those folks operating in much further northern regions or who have much older fleets, that might even be a little bit higher, closer to 3. So what's a benchmark? So for example, one common benchmark we use at Mercury is $1,800 per VEU. So if you go back to that previous example, that group was $2,780 per VEU. So they have a ways to go that they can improve their costs. So the next step would be to identify, well, what's driving these costs? Why are our costs so high? Is our fleet too old? Do our operators think? Are people not caring for them, et cetera, et cetera. But at the very least, you've been able to identify, hey, our costs are too high. Obviously, this $1,800 mark is a generalized mark. You may have to adjust for local variance. So certain parts of the country, that might be way too high of a benchmark to use, and other parts of the country that may be a little low. Okay, and then you have to verify the data and interpret. So what is the basis of the cost amount? Was it budgeted cost or was it actual expenditures? Well, if it wasn't actual, then maybe you're judging on something unfair. Is the cost amount consistent with historical trends? So if you got to that number of 3 point something million, and in all the previous years it was 2.5, then maybe there's something off. Maybe something got screwed up in the financial data. What's included and excluded from the cost amount? So this is really important step when you're benchmarking. This is one of the challenges of benchmarking, especially in fleet. I referenced earlier that even within NCSFA, it's very challenging to benchmark against your colleagues because of the nature of your organizations being so different. There was a survey a few years back, and again, you're all quite diverse. So some of you have in-house maintenance and repair programs, some of you don't. Some of you essentially manage a motor pool for the state, and your agencies manage their own fleets. Others are managing the entire fleet for all agencies. So when you're benchmarking, these are important things to consider. Are you comparing, apples to apples? So in your costs, did infrastructure and other overhead costs get included? Um, you know, do you have administration costs or other transaction management costs? For example, outsourced M&R services. Parts prices, shop charges, upselling of services. So some organizations don't try to capture all of the time and effort associated with providing a service, and so there's no markups. So these are key things. You have to make sure that your attributes of your organization line up when you're comparing benchmarks. So that $1,800 benchmark I shared earlier, that's generally a number we use when we have what we consider to be a fully burdened cost. All right. Again, service levels. You may have higher costs if you have longer shop hours, or more shop days, certainly, right? Or if your fleet organization is only providing to, let's say, a fire department or other emergency services, your cost per VEU may in fact be correct to be a little bit higher, right? And then the next question really is, what proportion of that cost, of the in-source cost, is avoidable? Let's say if all M&R work were outsourced, certainly that does not mean that all of your costs would be outsourced. Some of that cost would be simply unavoidable. One example would be you'd still need someone to manage the outsourced providers. So that we could do a whole nother session on avoidable and in-source versus outsourced metrics comparisons and how to assess if you'd be better off considering either insourcing or outsourcing. That's a whole nother topic. But one thing I just wanted to point out is you have to make sure to differentiate avoidable costs from unavoidable costs when doing that kind of analysis. So another thing to consider is that, you're going to need different metrics for different stakeholders, right? So senior decision makers at your customer agencies, they're going to care about downtime, right? And availability. They want to know about breakdowns. They want to know about the things that are impacting their work, right? They want to know what is, ratio of actual to budget expenses. Why? Because, you help them to develop their fleet budget. They want to know this. Is that accurate? And if it's not, why not? Is it because something happened that year, or is it because, something's wrong with the budgeting process? And obviously they want to know about their people and how their people are performing. So, they want to know a crash rate. And again, I won't read all of these to you, but you can see, depending on the staff and the level of the organization and who you're talking to, different metrics may be important to you. Again, if I'm fleet management, I want to know all about the PM schedule adherence rate. Because, when folks come to me and they want to know, well, hey, how's it going? And can we get this cost down? And, what can we do better and we can do not? The first question I want to know is, well, what can you do better? Are you on time with your PMs? Are you keeping up your end of the bargain? So forth and so on. So these are some, common metrics that we would calculate or we'd recommend people to calculate. And again, depending on where you are in the organization, you might have different interests in those. Here's another set I thought I would just drop up there. This is a few of many, what is it, 5 of many. Fleet availability rate, our target, our benchmark is 95%. PM program compliance should be 95% on time or better. Your scheduled repair rate, for those of you with in-house shops, should be in the 60 to 70% at least. The goal should be about 85%. Road call and tow rate, 2% or less. And your comeback rate. So, what portion of repairs are coming back to you after they've been given back to the customer. We want to see that at 1% or lower. Some other metrics that I think are really good to use and really important when you're measuring the performance of your system. All right, some first in maintenance and repair. Again, we have the cost per VEU, which we spoke about already. We talked about avoidable costs. So what portion of the cost that of your technical, your in-house labor cost as a percentage of your local shop labor. So, you do a quick little survey of your local shop labor rates. I normally suggest separating sort of private or independent with OEM shops, but you can certainly look at both and look at yours as a percentage. Is it 75%? Is it 125%? Focusing on avoidable costs that could actually be eliminated by outsourcing. Okay. Again, scheduled repair rate, what percentage of repairs were planned. Obviously, the bulk of that will come out of PMs. I like to hybridize, a lot of folks will recognize two of these very common metrics, and I like to take a hybrid of the two. I think that it's quite insightful. So most people are familiar with maintenance technician productivity rate, how many hours charged to work orders as a percentage of pay hours. So in government settings, you want to see at least 70%. In high performing government settings, and in private sector settings, you want to see at least 75%. If you can do better than that, if you can get into the 80 and 85% range, then you're a well-performing fleet. Make sure to account for overtime and things like that, and normalize your data on that side. The other one, again, we talked about it, is the comeback rate. What portion of repairs are coming back to the shop? And again, you can do this with you can calculate comeback rate for sublet services as well. What portion of repairs have to go back to the vendor to be completed? It's very important. So both of these are very important common metrics that I think most of you are probably familiar with. I like to look at a hybridized version of the two, where you basically take the hours charged to work orders and you subtract out hours associated with the comeback rate. Most of you will try to assign comebacks to the same mechanic, but this now hybridizes productivity with with quality, and you can get an all-in metric of your technician. All right, a couple more. Motor pool and equipment. All right, what is your fully loaded cost? All direct and indirect costs per motor vehicle rental day as a percentage of your local commercial rate. That'll help give you insight as to whether or not you're competitive, and whether or not whatever value adds are associated with having your own motor pool are worth, let's say, the difference in cost. Maybe one of the value adds is you're cheaper, but they're certainly reasonable that you might be more expensive than the local rental company, and yet you should still have that motor pool. Again, data has context. What are the value adds that you have? But this will give you a measurement to compare that against. A big one is your average rental days as a percentage of available rental days. So if the asset's available 365 days and it goes out 180, okay, then you know what the utilization was for that. Again, I like to hybridize common metrics. For fleet safety, you look at crash per million miles driven, the most common fleet safety metric. The next most common is probably average repair cost per crash. So if you can get the average vehicle repair cost per million miles driven, risk managers love that. They love that metric. So if you can send that their way, they'll be happy with you. And then a couple of others here: fleet utilization, annual usage, whether that's miles or engine hours, trips, hours, and days of use, as a percentage of the class average. Obviously, that gives you a sense of that vehicle's usage. This is a big one. Your average de facto replacement cycle as a percentage of the recommended target. So de facto replacement cycle is if your replacements are distributed evenly, you can look at the median age of the asset and double it. And that is your de facto replacement cycle. So if the median age of the assets within a class are 9 years, then necessarily that means you're replacing them on average every 18 years. And then what's the target? So if the target is 15 years, you can gain some insight very quickly as to what's going on with your replacement plan and all of the trickle down effects that has on everything else: M&R, downtime, availability, et cetera, et cetera. Another big one is replacement backlog. So the cost of replacing all the overdue assets in your fleet as a percentage of the total fleet replacement cost. All right. So some key things to remember before we move on to the next section is metrics should be used to assess performance relative to clearly defined goals and objectives. All of these performance measures are irrelevant if there's not a particular goal or objective from which you're going to. Okay, it's really important. Again, depending on the objective, you can get different performance statistics for the same metric. Right. Again, data capture is everything. Data codification is everything, and obviously verification processes. So if you have bad data, a lot of this work is fun to watch. So it really does start with data capture and data aggregation. Okay. Benchmarks must be chosen with care. Again, with those apples to apples, make sure you're comparing, the same kind of organization to the same kind of organization, and more importantly, the practices within it. So again, if you compare your cost per VEU and you're fully burdened, and your next door neighbor is not fully burdened, you're going to feel like you're you're too expensive, when in fact you may be hitting the nail on the head. Okay. Now, metrics are really not going to lead to definitive conclusions about how to improve performance. They're there to kind of give you an indicator as to what performance is. Again, you're measuring performance. So it's to shine a spotlight on where it is that you need to focus and where it is that you need to, put your effort into trying to improve things. Okay, so outside of fleet performance, I wanted to talk briefly about some other uses. So we talked about performance measurement. The next one is decision support, so strategic and tactical, and again, the development of business intelligence. So just some quick example. I'll give you a couple definitions here and then some quick examples. So again, decision support is a process designed to aid in determining and evaluating alternative courses of action. So in other words, you're using data to look at several different paths forward and seeing which one is better. Okay, I won't read all that to you, but essentially most of you are comfortable or familiar with the idea of performing what if analyses. But instead of having this just be an intellectual exercise, you're doing that with data. Another, really the third type is business intelligence. Okay, so again, this is really designed to spot or dig out or analyze hard data. It's really, I'd like to say it's a way to learn about the nature of your organization. Okay, again, we have here strengths and weaknesses. We have some other things that really this is used for, but I would argue one of the greatest things that you can do with this type of analysis is begin to have insight into behavior. Okay, fleet user behavior, et cetera, and potentially give you insight on how to modify that behavior. So again, I won't spend a lot of time here. I'm going to rush through these. I know there's some formulas on here. They may not be complicated. They may be complicated. We can always talk more about them, offline or something like that. But here's an example of the decision support. Okay, determining optimal vehicle replacement cycles. Let me give you these definitions. EAC stands for equivalent annual cost. For those of you who are in engineering or project managers, you'll be pretty familiar with that. NPV is net present value. R is your discount rate. And N is the length of years of the stream of course. So essentially what you do is you get all of your annual costs, your capital, your operating costs, etc. And you perform this formula. Obviously in Excel or similar type of program will make this a lot easier. But essentially you perform this calculation for a number of years, for a set of number of years, and you find where the low point is. And we can talk more about that later if there's time. So you might put in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, etc., and determine, okay, well, my equivalent annual cost at year 7 is at its lowest, and we're currently replacing this vehicle at year 10 or year 11 or year 12. So we could save some money by replacing these vehicles more quickly, or vice versa. Okay. Internal motor pool rental rates. So again, R is the rental rate for a vehicle, a piece of equipment, type I. Right. So what you do is you take your total projected annual cost for providing that vehicle type I. Type could mean class, let's say pickup trucks. And then you divide by your projected annual utilization. You use historical data to guess how many times that vehicle will be rented. And there's the rental rate, a very simple way to do motor pool rental rates, especially if you're just doing daily rates. And you can do that with each class or each vehicle type in your motor pool and come up with appropriate rental rate. Okay. Again, try to gain insight, try to gain business intelligence, try to change behavior. So as you can see here for this organization, essentially you can pretty much say that as PM compliance improve, vehicle repair costs went down. I mean, that's pretty clear to see. All right. And this is an example of simple data visualization, which we'll talk more about later, that can help you to see those kinds of things. Okay. This one is a scatter plot, and what you're seeing is all of these little squares or diamonds are individual assets costs at different mileages. So the x-axis is the mileage, and the y-axis is the M&R cost. And so as you can see, it runs the gambit. But clearly, as you develop a trend line by conducting a regression analysis, you can see, obviously, and I don't think it would surprise anyone, as life-to-date mileage goes up, M&R costs also go up. But you can gain real insight as to what that curve actually looks like for different classes and different types of vehicles. It will not look the same. In other words, the point at which that curve starts to spike up may be very different for different types of vehicles. again, people kind of accept, they over accept that previous slide's theorem, which is that as things age or get used more, they get more expensive. This is another scatter plot in which all of the various costs are plotted over the vehicle's age. As you can see, it runs the gambit. There are, assets that are 9 and 10 years old that have costs very similar to assets that are 2 or 3 years old. So it's not going to work on every asset individually, but certainly you can see that there are clusters that develop and form. And clearly, again, if you run a correlation analysis, you'll see that there's a direct correlation between asset age and its costs if given enough data points. Okay. Again, I'm going to go through these next ones real quickly, but again, you might hear here recommended fleet replacement expenditures and current fleet maintenance expenditures. Okay, probable and preferable. You add them up, and you can see the total cost of impact of ownership and how that those costs may change. You see how I'm doing? Okay. So visualizing data, again, I just wanted to put a word on this. Again, I mentioned earlier that reporting is key. So putting out things like PM compliance reports, that's a fairly common practice, I think, for NCSFA fleet managers. If it's not something you're doing, that's something that absolutely should be getting done. I don't mean telling people what PM is coming due. Obviously, that's included as well, but compliance, right? And that should be reported out not only to the users, but up to your leadership, to leadership as a whole. You take that concept and really start to produce maybe short outputs monthly and maybe some larger ones quarterly. The key way to get a lot of information across to people quickly and easily and simply is with graphics and by visualizing data and using visual aids. So the whole picture is worth 1,000 words. I just wanted to share a few thoughts on that. Everything you're about to see was done in nothing fancy. I didn't use Tableau or BI or any other fancy software. Everything you're about to see was done in Excel or something really similar to it, intentionally. So again, we kind of see this as a cyclical thing, informed decisions. So again, you got to prioritize that data. You got to organize that on what is the data that you need to measure the things you want to measure. You got to organize it. And knowing what you want to measure, that tells you a bit about the organization, and then obviously visualizing the data. As you learn from the results of your analyses, that might influence what data you want to collect in the future, and therefore how you prioritize data and what tools you need to collect and organize that data. So here are just some really simple examples. Again, all of this is in Excel. This graph on the right is a stock graph that Excel will do for you. It's a box and whisker graph. It's really good for identifying outlier assets quickly. So in this case, we're looking at utilization. So, a simple behavior modification opportunity is to rotate vehicle assignment. You have these extreme outliers and they're not all clustered in the middle and you have a bunch on the top and a bunch on the bottom. That's an indicator that, the users are, they're clearly leaning on some vehicles and the others are sitting there. And you don't want that because you don't want to replace vehicles too quickly, and you don't want them to be replaced too late, and you leave a lot of money on the table if the utilization is not distributed evenly. An asset daily use schedule. So here is something that you can pull some data out of telematics. I don't think many telematics organizations are doing this analysis for you just yet, but you can pull that data out and essentially overlap it. So these vehicle numbers are all the same type of vehicle. Off the top of my head, I want to say they were a half-ton pickup truck. Don't hold me to that. And essentially what we've done is mapped out when each of these assets were in use. And you look for overlaps, right? Now, in some applications, this may not be helpful, but certainly in shared use applications, whether it's departmental shared use or motor pool, this can give you a whole heck of a lot of insight as to how many you need because of that overlapping, right? Because, again, if you have 5 trucks out there with 5 users and they're never using them at the same time, there's an opportunity to do some sharing. Right sizing data, right? You may have a scatter plot of assets. Here what you have on the right is a scatter plot where we show their normalized utilization and the criticality, and then you just draw a line at the intercepts. So it's pretty clear. Everything to the right is both utilized heavily and critical. Everything to the lower left of the red line is not utilized heavily and is also not ranked very critically. And everything in the middle is sort of the review and come back to them. Okay. In this example, the 40th percentile is a fail and the 60th percentile is a fail. Okay. Motor pool right sizing. This is kind of one of my favorites. As you can see, essentially what we've done is plotted out a sedan's daily use over the course of 5 years here. And what we're doing is how many vehicles of that type were in use on literally every month of the year over 5 years. And we started with days, but we aggregated it into months. And this is pretty simple data. So this graph is made from a pretty simple spreadsheet. You know, hey, this was the vehicle, this is the type, this is the departure date and the return date. So you can figure out, you know, how many vehicles were in use each day. And as you can see in this graph, the max in 5 years was 126. Their current vehicle count is 137. So, you know, you tell me, is there an opportunity to right size that motor pool? 5-year average is 82. Obviously, you can do this. You can look at the most recent year. You can weight it differently. But certainly, it starts to give you some insight as to some potential opportunities to make decisions. Or also, for that matter, some business intelligence on what is the behavior of your users. Time. Again, you know, we talked earlier about optimal replacement cycle analyses. Here we have some of the data we talked about in that formula essentially plotted. As you can see, you have operating costs, and I'm colorblind, but that's sort of an orangey line, I think. And then capital costs start higher and come down and flatten out. And total costs are just the accumulation of the two. And then, you know, by graphing this and visualizing it, it's pretty darn clear as day as to when is the optimal time to replace this asset. And it's somewhere between that 5 and not quite 7 year mark where the total cost of ownership bottoms out. Replacement financing, okay? So what you have in the blue bars is what the necessary growth fleet replacement costs are, all right? This shaded green area there is the reserve fund balance. And then the red line is the reserve fund revenues, how much is coming in based on the chargeback each year. Well, by plotting those 3 points, you can tell a lot, right? You know, so let's go to the next example and I can show you what I mean. So what you have is, you know, in one example, that's their current reserve balance. And in the example on the right, that's what that reserve balance, you know, shrunk, you know, very dramatically to 6 million from about 14 to about 6 million. Now, don't hate me. I know, no, don't touch my reserve fund. You know, I get it. But for some of you who've lived through that, you know, that sometimes that's unavoidable. So the question is, do you have enough balance or not? How do you know what the appropriate amount is? And so by modeling the revenue streams and your replacement costs each year, you can actually analyze that. And as you can see, at no point, even if you drop from 14 million to 6 million, at no point does this reserve fund need a cash infusion. There is always a balance. I should have clicked that before I said that. You know, another thing you can do is compare loan payments. All right. So again, you map it out. The cumulative cash savings is this red line. So every time you spend less on your loan payments than you did in your total replacement spend, you get an accumulative savings. The yellow line is your annual cash savings. And what you can see is over time, sure, it goes down, but even as it gets lower in later years, the overall gain in cash is tremendous. So there are a lot of organizations, many of whom are resistant to debt financing, who in fact could do a lot for their budget and free up a lot of cash by considering debt financing. And this is just one of such organizations, you know, examples. And then finally, I wanted to just show this example here, which is, you know, really common. This could be for a whole bunch of different analyses, is really very similar. But in this case, we were looking at potentially looking at building an M&R shop. And where would be the ideal M&R shop based on that organization's domicile locations to each asset. And so again, you can build this out pretty, you know, fairly simply. Not in Excel, so I lied about that one. You need a GIS software for this. But essentially, what you can do is optimize what that sensor location is. We do the same kind of analysis for determining charging stations, M&R facilities, fuel stations, storage houses, that sort of a thing, and figure out where the optimal locations are, you know, to build such things and to make that kind of an investment. Make sure you get high utilization, because obviously infrastructure is a big investment. All right, so I know I went through a lot really quickly. I wanted to at least kind of cover the scope, cover the breadth of things that are involved with, using data for fleet management. Obviously, not enough time to get into detail on any one thing, but hopefully this served as sort of an introduction or a, sort of a mouth, wetting the palate, and triggers you to get some more information, and hopefully it's helpful to you all.
Thank you so much, Mark, for presenting. We had one question from Holly. She asked if you will have the slide deck available.
Sure, Holly, send me an email if you don't mind, and I'll try to get it out to you ASAP.
Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to unmute.
I know that was a lot very quick, so hopefully that's okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for participating. And don't forget that the workshop is being held next month, October 19th to 22nd. I hope you have registered. If not, it's on the website. You'll find the 2021 workshop tab. You can register right from there. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you too, Lauren. Have a great day.